Good morning. My name is Tony Mansueto. Welcome to Seeking Wisdom and to our continuing series on power and the common good, the elements of organizing. Today we are going to be talking about global strategy or civilizational strategy, which is really the highest level of strategy, and its roots in social theory. We'll be arguing that at the very most fundamental level, social theory is an attempt to develop a strategy for global and civilizational change or conservation, and that strategy at this level is fundamentally the practical application of our understanding of how human societies work. And before we get started, if you like this video, please push the like button and subscribe so that you can be informed of both subsequent videos in this series and in upcoming series. And also check out our website, seekingwisdom.com, guidefortheperplexed.org, brigata.org, The Desire to Be God, and The Alchemist's Kitchen.org. And if you are interested in supporting us, you can do so through our Patreon page. All of those addresses are listed on this slide. I'd like to begin with a little bit of background, trying to understand the historical context out of which this discipline emerged. The fundamental context for the emergence of social theory is the enormous changes which were taking place in European society. Certainly these go back much further than the 19th century, but it was in the 19th century that people began to understand the interconnections between these developments and also the contradictions between them. And among those developments, we would identify most especially the Industrial Revolution, the development of capitalism, the liberal and democratic revolutions, and secularization, the decline, or at least apparent decline, of religion in European society. Within this context, social theory emerges out of what we might call mutations in philosophy, history, theology, and the fundamentally new discipline of political economy, which had just really begun to emerge in the previous century. And as we look at the various traditions in social theory, we will trace out these developments, these mutations in older disciplines that led to the emergence of social theory. We will be looking in particular at 4 different broad traditions with some internal variations. What we're going to call an evolutionary tradition, because it is very much rooted in the evolutionary theory, which emerged first actually out of political economy and then eventually migrated into biology, and then has had influence since then, backwashing into sociology once again. We're going to look at what we call the solidaristic tradition. This is often, I think, incorrectly referred to as functionalism. This is the tradition especially rooted in the work of Durkheim. We will look at the interpretive sociological tradition, which comes out of the work of Weber, and the dialectical tradition associated with Marx and Engels and their interpreters. Let's begin by looking at evolutionary social theory. The roots of an evolutionary approach to social theory, I would argue, lie in political economy, and in particular in the work of Adam Smith, which analyzes the way in which free markets select for certain practices. From there, I would suggest it's carried into biology by Darwin and others, and then back into the sociological context by social Darwinists, sociobiologists, and by information theoretical neoliberals who differ, however, I'm going to suggest, over the unit of selection, which is involved in the evolutionary process. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. This approach is often also called positivistic, although I would want to make clear that it's entirely different from the French positivism of Auguste Comte and the early Durkheim. So, as we said, attempts to apply evolutionary theory in a social context, actually, it's really relevant in any context, um, differ fundamentally from each other around the unit of selection. And so there's a trend called sociobiology that holds that the unit of selection in the evolutionary process is the gene, and that individual organisms and, frankly, even human societies and various practices that human societies develop are simply mechanisms for helping genes reproduce themselves. Social Darwinism and its revival in the human biodiversity or HBD tendency, on the other hand, holds that the unit of selection is the individual or the race. And this is really the foundation both for a lot of 19th century defenses of the inequality that accompanied the process of capitalist development, and it is also the basis for a great deal of so-called scientific, more properly pseudoscientific racism. And then finally, there is what we will call the information theoretical neoliberalism associated with the Austrian School of Economics, people like Friedrich Hayek, who hold that the unit of selection is neither the gene nor the individual, and certainly not the race, but rather what he calls a practice. And we'll clarify that in a minute. A feature that is shared by all of these tendencies is that since following Darwin, they tend to regard innovation as spontaneous and random, their strategy for progress is focused on mechanisms of selection, which are designed to weed out the less fit. And so these tendencies all take a relatively favorable view of things such as disease, war, and the marketplace. Of these various tendencies, the one that has been most influential and which has really formed part of mainstream political discourse for the past 40 or 50 years. The most important one in that sense is the evolutionary or information theoretical neoliberalism associated with the Austrian school, and in particular with Friedrich Hayek's variant of that school's doctrine. Hayek is one of the key figures in terms of the latter part of the 20th century because it was his ideas which shaped most fundamentally the policies of the Thatcher and Reagan governments, and thus the whole neoliberal turn in the latter part of the 20th century. So for Hayek, we can know only facts, events, and patterns of facts and events. He is a strict empiricist, follows Hume, is even skeptical about ideas of causality. And so he doesn't really believe that there is anything, for example, such as a human society or a civilization or deep structures, because those are not objects of possible sense experience. What he sees when he looks at what most of us would call human society are human individuals who are struggling to survive and prosper under conditions of scarcity. And to do this, they develop various practices. And by practices, he could mean a technology, an economic system like the free market or socialism or feudalism, political structures, cultural practices like language or the family or various religions. And his view is that some of these work and become part of an established tradition, and others don't and are discarded. We should note here that this way of understanding society was a key link in allowing the fusion which developed between classical liberalism and libertarianism, which is obviously focused, at least in principle, on human freedom, and social conservatism. And the idea is that if you look carefully here, it is not so much that freedom is actually being elevated as a prime value. We'll see that Hayek doesn't really have a way of doing that, but rather just that the free market in particular is shown to have survival value, something that he also assigns to traditional family values and religion. Even though he himself is not a believer, religion has survival value for Hayek, not truth value. Larger perspective leads Hayek to take a radically pro-market, pro-capitalist perspective. He argues that the marketplace acts as an information accessing and processing system, which takes data from buy and sell decisions and aggregates it as supply and demand, providing instructions in the form of prices regarding how much of each commodity to produce. He argues that centrally planned economies cannot access this information, and that results in the sort of irrationalities we saw, for example, in the Soviet Union, where you had a great deal of investment in heavy industry, much less investment in consumer goods, resulting in stockpiled iron rusting in warehouses and long lines for bread and clothing, for example. Now, I would suggest that Hayek makes some important contributions in identifying what's often called the knowledge problem in socialist societies, which unfortunately those of us on the left have not been able to fully address yet. But there are a number of problems with his theory. First, he leaves social structures, which may be independent of individual action, completely invisible. Second, he is agnostic regarding questions of meaning and value. He regards these simply as questions of personal preference. And of course, that opens up the door to all kinds of bizarre preferences, such as human sacrifice or genocide or other things. And ultimately, whatever value the marketplace may have as an information system, it doesn't know which activities promote human development, and it doesn't know how those activities affect the integrity of the ecosystem and social fabric. And so the marketplace may well end up allocating resources to luxury consumption rather, for example, than inner city education. So that gives a little bit of a flavor of some of the problems with this approach. The second approach I'd like to look at is the interpretive sociology associated with Max Weber. This perspective derives from the application of post-Kantian German philosophy, German idealism, not primarily of the Hegelian variety, but of a more pessimistic and skeptical variety, to the study of history. In particular through the work of Wilhelm Dilthey, who looked at what really defined history as a discipline, which was focused on the meaning of particular actions, the meaning of particular patterns in history. This interpretive approach emphasizes that human action is different from other objects of study because it has meaning. And it is this search for meaning which defines what the Germans call the Geistwissenschaften, or the humanities or spiritual sciences. Often we will call this a hermeneutic approach, hermeneutics being the art and science of interpretation. And Weber takes this approach to economic history and, moving from the individual fact, an event, or action to broader patterns, invents what we call interpretive sociology. So Weber argues that human social action is distinguished by the fact that we give meaning to our actions and orient them in relationship to the actions of others. The second part is what makes them social. And sociology is the study of shared typical meanings. which Weber then classifies into what he calls ideal types. Not ideal in the sense of the best, but ideal in the sense of kind of a cluster of similar patterns that you can identify. They're kind of heuristic categories, not so much underlying objective structures. And so he identifies kind of four master categories. He talks about traditional action and traditional societies where things are done because that's the way they've always been done. He talks about affective action, which is catalyzed by powerful emotions. And the key example here is what he calls charisma, which is action that is evoked by the vision and personality of a charismatic leader who appeals to people's hopes and fears and aspirations. And this really is central then to Weber's whole approach to social change. Third, instrumentally rational action, which uses reason to seek the most efficient way of achieving an end or purpose. And that is the type of action that he argues has become dominant in industrial capitalist societies. And finally, value rational action, which uses reason to determine what ought to be done. Sometimes we call this substantive rationality. For Weber, history is what he calls a war of gods, or to use the more modern language associated with Samuel Huntington, it's a clash of civilizations. So different groups develop and advance different visions of what it means to be human, different ideals. And they come into interaction with each other, they come into conflict with each other because these various ideals are incommensurate. And there is kind of an intersection to some extent with the evolutionary approach in that some of these ideals may turn out to have more survival value than others, and so we get Weber beginning to argue that there is kind of a selection operating in favor of what we call instrumental rationality. Left Weber with a problem, though, because he was trying to connect the development of interworldly asceticism with the development of industrial capitalism. And while certainly Judaism and Islam were intensely progressive interworldly traditions that focused a great deal on world transformation and contributed a great deal to science and to the development of technology, they're not the traditions that were associated with the development of industrial capitalism. On the contrary, when he looked at what was happening in Europe, Weber found that capitalism was very much associated with the Protestant countries of northwestern Europe, and in particular with Calvinism. So he had to kind of re-theorize Calvinist Christianity as an interworldly asceticism. And this is his well-known Protestant ethic thesis. So for Weber, Calvinism was defined by the ideas that, first of all useful work serves God's purpose. So there is nothing more religious, for example, about banking or baking than there is about liturgy or preaching, for example. So all useful work is part of and as a way of serving God's purpose in the world. Second, he argued that for the Calvinists, God had determined before the foundation of the world that some would be saved and others damned. And finally, that those who are saved will likely be doing useful work. And so he argues that this creates an intense anxiety that encourages people to analyze their spiritual state in order to determine whether or not they're saved. You can't do anything about it, and you can never be sure. Okay? It's absolutely critical. You can never be sure, but you have signs that you might be saved, and the main sign is that you work hard, save, and invest. If you work hard just to slack off later on in a comfy retirement, then you're headed downstairs. Okay? If you work hard, but then do it primarily to enjoy yourself, you're headed downstairs. Okay? So what this does is to lead people to look at their level of work and savings and investment as a sign of salvation. And this, he argues, encourages capitalist development. It forms people, frames people in a way that leads to the development of capitalism. So, what are the strategic implications of this interpretive sociological perspective? Broadly speaking, there have been two main types of conclusions, two different sorts of strategic conclusions that people have drawn from Weber's work. The older approach was to argue that Weber had demonstrated more or less definitively that not only that capitalism was particularly effective at providing the resources to advance and defend the values upheld by European and North American society, but also that that society itself was in fact dependent on not just European values in general, but specifically on Calvinism, on Reformed Protestantism. And so in the post-war period, post-World War II period, there developed a tendency called developmentalism that argued that if the United States was going to prevail globally and defeat socialism, defeat the Soviet Union, that it needed to address the problem of underdevelopment in the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This in turn meant promoting industrialization and the formation of a more robust and growth-oriented capitalism. And that the way to do that was primarily to change the culture. And so we see emerging an organically, not simply colonial attitude towards Latin American culture, African culture, Asian culture, but actually an organically anti-Catholic attitude. And so there's some folks who basically say the way to promote instrumental rationality is through Protestant missionary efforts. That is essentially what had been going on for a very long time in many parts of the world already. More broadly, however, the idea was that this kind of instrumental rationality could be inculcated in a more secularized form through the educational system. And so if you look at the work of agencies like the Agency for International Development, you can see that a lot of its early work was basically focused on cultural transformation that was then going to promote industrialization and capitalist development, and presumably, therefore, democracy, rule of law, pluralism, although none of that was ever really demonstrated. More recently, we've seen the emergence of another take on Weber's theory, another take on the strategic implications of Weber's theory, and this comes from Samuel Huntington. And this was a response to the argument put forward by Francis Fukuyama after the collapse of the Soviet Union that we had reached the end of history, that industrial society, capitalism, democracy, secularism were all triumphant now, and that there would no longer be major ideological conflicts. And Huntington, just a little bit later than that, in the early 90s, is looking around and he sees the Balkan Wars, he sees the continuing growth of fundamentalist Islam, and argues that no, Weber was actually right when he said that history is a war between the gods, not in a literal sense, but in the sense of a clash of ideals, that human civilizations are constituted by fundamentally different and clashing ideals, and that therefore conflict and war are inevitable. This became a major bulwark of the neoconservative trend that came to prominence, especially in the second Bush administration. First Bush administration was actually, I think, closer probably to Fukuyama, and basically argued that we needed to actively, aggressively, and militarily promote our values if we were going to survive in the world. Once again, some really powerful insights here. Particularly, I would suggest the Protestant ethic. I don't think we can really understand our own society apart from it. Even if we're not Protestant, we have been formed and shaped by a largely Protestant culture. And you can see this simply in virtue of the fact that the first thing we ask someone when we meet them is, "What do you do?" And we tend to identify ourselves with our resumes, with our curriculum vitae. Still, though, there are some major problems. This does not explain where ideas come from. Weber seems to assume that ideas simply develop spontaneously. He does not actually explain why some ideas develop and take hold in some places and not others. Second, he tends to take the development pattern of Protestant Europe as normative. He does not, for example, explain effectively why, for many years, it was India and China and the Muslim world which were the dominant technological and economic powers on the planet. Why, even in the modern era, a place like Japan, which certainly wasn't Protestant, was able to develop very quickly. And the larger view, the idea that history is a war between the gods or a clash of civilizations, tends to legitimate violence and treat conquest as inevitable. And it's not entirely clear that that's true. The next tradition that we're going to look at, I am calling solidarism, although you would find it discussed in most sociology textbooks or even histories of social theory as functionalism. I'm going to argue that functionalism is a more adequate term for a subvariant of this perspective, structural functionalism associated with the work of Talcott Parsons. But the fundamental concept at the root of the tradition is the whole idea of solidarity. This tradition has its roots actually in French traditionalism, which was a response to the rationalism of the Enlightenment and a movement deeply and profoundly critical of the democratic revolutions generally and of the French Revolution in particular. This was a tradition that emphasized the priority of social facts over individual freedom, that argued that the social order was established by God, that it was dependent on violence and sacrifice, and that the whole idea that human beings could transform their society and restructure it by means of collective action was fundamentally misguided. And the main right-wing version of this traditionalism associated with de Bonald and de Maistre was actively supportive of counter-revolution of the monarchy, of the aristocracy, and to a lesser extent of the church, although the church eventually condemned the doctrine at the First Vatican Council. There were thinkers associated with this tradition who were more aligned with the center or left, and emphasized that revolutionary movements are spiritual as well as economic and political. And we see in particular a French thinker by the name of Ballanche in this regard, who did a great deal of analysis of the peasant uprisings that led to the development of democracy in Greece, and argues that they were as much struggles for full cultic participation for ordinary people as they were struggles for democracy and land reform. And we would also put in this tradition someone like Alexis de Tocqueville, who was not anti-democratic, but who shared many of the broader philosophical concerns of the traditionalists, and argued that democracy in the United States was different from that in France because it was not based on a kind of systematic attempt to totally reorganize society through society-wide, state-driven collective activity, but rather because we had done a particularly good job of cultivating institutions intermediate between the state and the marketplace. Now, what we see in France happening that's very interesting is we basically have Auguste Comte take traditionalism, and in fact, in many ways, the traditional right-wing traditionalism, and turn it on its head, and argues that there is a natural evolution of human society from theology to philosophy to science. And he advocates a complete secularized positivistic religion. So he actually proposes a new calendar where the days are associated with feasts of scientists and philosophers and artists rather than the traditional Catholic saints. This was actually a further rationalization of something that had been done during the French Revolution itself. And then Comte is, in many ways, a direct predecessor of Durkheim. Durkheim represented a kind of second generation in this tradition, or maybe even a third generation. And he kind of took the core ideas of traditionalism and positivism and turned them into what he at least would have considered to be scientific concepts. And his key assertion is that society is a reality in itself that is distinct from and prior to the individuals that are its members. We become individuals as a result of the way society forms us. We are not individuals who then create society. And he suggests that societies change in a couple of different ways. First, growing population density requires technological progress if we're going to support more people on the same amount of land. And that eventually leads to the division of labor, not just to what he called the social division of labor between butchers and bakers and candlestick makers, but the technical division of labor, which divides, say, candlestick making into many, many different separate assembly line tasks that can be performed by unskilled workers. And he says that this process in turn, which is more or less identical with the Industrial Revolution and capitalist development, leads to what he calls egoism, a lack of sense of belonging, anomie, which is a lack of a sense of meaning, and that this, he argues, is what leads to the fact that it is the most advanced societies in Europe in the late 19th century, the predominantly Protestant and secular northwest of Europe, rather than the predominantly Catholic and more traditional, more religious south and east of Europe, which has a skyrocketing suicide rate. And he also associates it with crime and other types of social problems. He also, however, identifies another source of social change, which he calls collective effervescence, which is the unusually intense social interaction which takes place in the context of a revolution or a festival, when people come into contact with each other in a more intense way. They get in touch with higher meanings and values, which can then lead to social renewal. This latter phenomenon then leads him to become very much interested in religion. Durkheim was a secular Jew who appreciated enormously the fact that the French revolutions had gradually reduced the influence of the church and made at least formal legal freedom and full participation in society a possibility for Jews like himself. But he was also aware of these kinds of social strains and these social contradictions and the sense of isolation and meaninglessness which was affecting people. So he decided to identify what was most fundamental in religion and see if that could shed any light on the problem for him. And so he engaged not so much in original research, but in secondary analysis of research on various hunter-gatherer and horticultural societies, and eventually settles on the idea that the elementary form of religion, as he calls it, is totemism. You probably heard of totem poles associated with indigenous peoples in the northwestern part of North America. He was focused on totemism in Australia among the Aboriginal population there. And the basic idea in totemism is that there is a worship of animal, plant, or sometimes mineral species. And what Durkheim argues is that these are collective representations. They're symbols of the clan, symbols of the tribe, and he then generalizes from that to the idea that religious symbols generally are collective representations of social structure. So, for example, if you have a society with many different tribes and many different clans, and they're all competing with each other, while each tribe might have its own totem or principal deity, you're not going to have a single high god. But when you get a king, and so the society is in fact governed by a single person, well, suddenly the universe is governed by a single person, and you get a high god. And then when you move into a capitalist society where, yes, you have a state, you may even still have a king, but it's obvious that there's this kind of spontaneous process going on that makes most of the decisions in the society, well, then the idea of God tends to fade away. Associated with this, he looks at religious rituals as a way of bringing people together and reinforcing their social bonds. Again, he calls this collective effervescence, and it's something that is characteristic of the communion feasts of peoples who practice totemic religions, who throughout the year do not eat their totemic animal, no kangaroo burgers, but who do ultimately come together and consume the totemic species in a single communion feast at periodic intervals. And it's also characteristic of secular festivals, what we today would call civil religion. So things like the 4th of July parade, fireworks, the Thanksgiving dinner, all of these are rituals that reinforce, in that case, some definition of American identity. And so with Durkheim, then, we have a very different vision of how to come to terms with the contradictions of an industrial capitalist and rapidly secularizing society. Durkheim treasures secularism for the freedoms it offers, but as we've noted, is concerned about the egoism and anomie that it engenders and argues for balancing it. First of all, with a kind of restored guild system, which not just organizes workers to protect their material interest and affect the political process, but which is organized by trades or professions and which focuses people on the meaning of their individual contributions to society. He also was charged with the government of the Third Republic, with developing a system of secular moral education, which links the ideal of rational autonomy with a sense of belonging and meaning. And so Durkheim provides a very interesting and distinctive approach to looking at the contradictions of a capitalist society. You may also have heard the term functionalism associated with someone by the name of Talcott Parsons, who, at least in his own mind, was attempting to synthesize Weber and Durkheim. Parsons' fundamental idea is that different social structures have different functions. And there are 4 basic functions: adaptation to the physical environment, something that is handled by technology and the economy; goal orientation or decision making, which is handled by the political system; social integration, keeping societies together, which is handled by families, neighborhoods, other types of intermediate organizations; and then latent pattern maintenance, which adapts to what he calls ultimate reality, and maintains the resulting cultural patterns, the beliefs and values. So here we would have certainly religious institutions, but also schools, universities, science, all of which are an attempt to help society understand and thereby adapt to the underlying nature of things. Now, Parsons is often regarded as a conservative because he tends to diminish the role of conflict, particularly class conflict in human societies. But he was actually a strong supporter of the social liberal policies of the post-war period, and really provides a theoretical foundation for that particular approach politically. On the one hand, he accepts the idea that capitalism has demonstrated its efficacy at helping human beings adapt to the environment and at generating wealth. But with Durkheim, he also argues that it leads to inequality and alienation. And so, again, along the lines of his general idea that as societies differentiate, they allow both greater freedom but also require greater efforts at integration. He argues for balancing capitalism with government regulation and with income transfers, which will rectify some of the inequalities and irrationalities, and also with strong intermediate social and cultural institutions in the context of which people can have a sense of belonging and in the context of which they can explore what it all means. Doesn't believe there needs to be a single overarching shared system of beliefs and values, but does believe that human beings are fundamentally creatures of meaning and value. Now, both Durkheim's work, what we're calling solidarism, and the later functionalism, structural functionalism, are often criticized for not acknowledging social contradictions or explaining social change. But I would argue that Durkheim does, in fact, analyze contradictions. Certainly, that is at the center of the division of labor in society. It's in the center of his work on suicide. And that his discussions of collective effervescence are, in fact, a theory of social change. We might argue that that theory is inadequate. On the other hand, would suggest that in many ways he captures an element that other theorists have not investigated as thoroughly. And the criticism may be more accurate for Talcott Parsons, again, at least to the extent that he doesn't really have an explanation of revolutionary social change, although there certainly are people who were influenced by his work who have looked at that question. But the whole idea of acknowledging the existence of contradictions is fundamental to his work, precisely because he sees those contradictions as creating the need for an integrating element and a meaning oriented element that compensates for them. I don't want to be seen as giving an endorsement to Parsons. I'm actually pretty sympathetic to Durkheim, but I don't think either one of them are entirely adequate, but I do think it's important to understand their contributions. Next, we are going to talk about the dialectical tradition, what is often referred to as historical materialism, the work deriving from Marx, Engels, Lenin, and their interpreters. Historical materialism is the application of the ideas of Marx to human societies globally, not just to the economy. Sometimes you'll hear it called dialectical social theory. Critical theory is kind of a variant of this approach. And generally speaking, historical materialism has understood itself as having three sources. German idealism. And here we have Marx's understanding of humanity as creative and capitalism as a kind of alienating structure which turns what ought to be our ends, namely our creativity, into simply a means of survival. And the idea of socialism is a way of transcending this alienation and making humanity the master of its own destiny. French socialism, very much associated in particular with Marx's social theory, with historical materialism, and it leads to the idea that class struggle is the main driver of historical change. And then finally, political economy, or Marx's critique of political economy, which shows that contrary to Adam Smith's expectations, free markets lead to insuperable contradictions, which eventually end up undercutting economic growth and development. Contradictions which, at least Marx believed, only socialism can overcome. Focusing in particular on historical materialism, Marx distinguishes between base and superstructure. The base is kind of the material foundations of human society. It's defined by the forces of production or technology, the type of technology, how a society produces, and the relations of production or the economic structure, how resources are centralized and allocated for production. The superstructure includes politics and culture, the structures which create the larger context, the larger institutional context in which economic activity is possible, and which form the types of human beings that a particular economic structure requires. Marx argues that as technology advances, it comes into conflict with the economic structure, leading to economic crisis, class struggle, and either civilizational collapse or social revolution. Marx is often either reviled or hailed as one of the great thinkers of modern atheism, but that really vastly overestimates the significance of religion in his thought. But Marx does put forward a theory of religion, and it is key to understanding his larger ideas, his larger vision of what it means to be human. He builds in this regard on the work of Hegel and Feuerbach. Hegel taught that religion was kind of an imaginative representation of a truth, which philosophy understands rationally. So it's kind of a picture language for people who can't do philosophy. But it contains important truths that philosophy unpacks. Feuerbach, who was a follower of Hegel, goes further and argues that religion represents an alienation of the creative potential which is latent in humanity, so that rather than owning ourselves as good and creative and powerful, we project those ideas onto God. And for Feuerbach, that's the fundamental problem with human society. Marx takes that idea, but expands it in a way that alters its meaning fundamentally. Marx argues that it's not possible for anything, for example, that alienation, to just appear. It doesn't just happen. And he argues that it's the result of the fact that humanity has historically been at the mercy of forces beyond its control. Before the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution, those were primarily the forces of nature. But even as those two revolutions have brought those forces to bay, in his mind at least, capital remains as the alienated embodiment of human creativity, as this global force that transcends our understanding and transcends our political capacities. And that as long as capital is lurking there in the background, there remains a social basis for religion. So our task is not to attack religion, but to attack capital. Once capital's gone, religion will, in a certain sense, wither away. Although you might also say that in a very real sense for Marx, religion will be realized, both transcended and realized. So communism, by transcending capital, takes philosophy's grasp of the rational core of religion and understanding creativity as the unity of existence in essence, understanding creativity as the power of being as such, it realizes that meaning by means of political action. All right, so how did Marx see change taking place? How did he see revolution taking place? Fundamentally, for Marx, revolutionary situations arise only when the development of the productive forces can no longer be accommodated within the existing relations of production, or to put that in different language, only when the process of technological development, technological progress, renders the existing economic structure obsolete, incapable of organizing and allocating the resources necessary for production. But within this context, for Marx, political development is fundamentally a function of increasing consciousness or understanding on the part of the proletariat. And if we look at the Communist Manifesto, for example, it's clear that he expected the proletariat would go through a number of different stages in the development of its class consciousness. At first, he argues, the proletariat will basically just be supporting the bourgeoisie in its struggle against the feudal aristocracy, and in particular in its struggle for democracy, and leveraging that support to gain things like universal suffrage. Once the democratic revolution is complete, though, and we begin to see the development of industrial production, workers who are experiencing the contradictions of capitalism will begin to take aim first at the new technology, at industrial technology. And this is the stage that we call sabotage. A sabot is a type of wooden shoe, and workers would literally take their shoes off and throw it into the machinery, busting up the works, hoping that it would be possible to return to traditional ways of producing. As workers begin to understand the limitations of this approach, they begin to organize. We enter the phase of trade unionism, where workers organize for better working conditions, better wages, within the context of the existing structure, still not looking for transformation. Those unions eventually become the basis for the formation of workers' parties that use democratic political struggle in the electoral arena in order to begin to influence public policy and eventually to form governments. As we'll see, this became a little bit more of a global strategy for socialism, certainly among social democrats. Marx himself, however, argued that it was insufficient because it would take a very specialized and advanced theoretical understanding of the nature of capitalism in order to understand why the system had to be transcended completely rather than simply reformed. And so he argues that the final stage is the development of communism, the emergence of a conscious leadership, which, as he puts it, understands the conditions, line of march, and ultimate general result of the struggle. Beyond that, Marx, although he says many different things at different places about what might happen after a communist regime came to power, whether through elections or through insurrection or something like that, in point of fact, there is no global overarching vision. And to a very large extent that was intentional, because Marx believed that you needed to address the particular contradictions of the particular situation in which you found yourself. And was very resistant to kind of vast utopian schemes. Now, this broader vision was subject to a range of different interpretations. And so we see, for example, Engels arguing that, while yes, you do need this conscious leadership, that can operate within the context of the democratic process. And Engels believed that as industry advanced, the proletariat would expand, and under conditions of universal suffrage, would more or less naturally become the dominant political force, and would be able then to leverage the instrument of the state in order to fundamentally transform the organization of society. Others began to draw on sources besides Marx to understand this process. And, for example, Edward Bernstein argued that the development of socialist consciousness was not simply a material process, not simply an automatic process of the development of the productive forces, but was a gradual development of rational autonomy among the masses. And between them, they represent two different tendencies in the development of social democratic thinking. Now, for a while, this seemed to be actually a reasonable description of the way reality was unfolding. Workers formed trade unions, they formed social democratic parties, they contested elections, they were beginning to exert a significant influence over policy. But then, when the First World War came, the vast majority of those social democratic parties supported their own bourgeoisies, and in other words, basically went to war against each other, and that seemed to many, Lenin and Russia among them, like a fundamental contradiction, fundamental abandonment and betrayal of the commitment to internationalism, which had been definitive of Marx's vision. So Lenin is trying to figure out what's going on, what is the problem, and he argues that the development of revolutionary consciousness in the proletariat is not spontaneous, and really begins to take that last little piece of Marx's strategy and elaborate it considerably. First, he argues that imperialism allows rich countries to exploit colonies in order to support, among other things, social reforms that create a labor aristocracy that actually resists revolution. And so this is what he sees happening with the social democratic parties supporting their own bourgeoisies in the First World War. They are engaged in a war, an inter-imperialist conflict, to expand their colonial empires, to extract more surplus from the colonies, so that it will be easier to fund social reforms at home. Lenin also points out that the commodification of labor power, as Marx understood it, undercuts the actual emergence of a communist consciousness and really halts its development at the trade union or reformist level. And so because of that, he argues that revolution requires a disciplined vanguard party which is composed of professional revolutionaries who can orchestrate the political struggle, who can organize and direct the historical process for all intents and purposes. And that you should not expect to be able to get the majority of people to understand the necessity of transcending capitalism. Instead, he argues for using what he called transitional demands, which appeal to the masses. They're direct, accessible, things that ordinary people can support without any theoretical preparation, and then use those to build support for the Communist Party by showing that they are the most effective advocates for those demands. For Lenin, that was land, bread, and peace. Those were the central demands that he brought against the provisional government. Probably the most influential was the demand for peace, the demand to pull Russia from the First World War. Later on, we see this strategy elaborated by Stalin and Dimitrov around the idea of a popular front against fascism, showing that the Communist Party are the most effective at fighting fascism. And then eventually, after the Second World War, really during and after the Second World War, we see Mao developing the idea that a communist party can come to power by showing its superior leadership in the struggle against colonialism, the struggle for national liberation. Now, there are some variants of the vanguard strategy, the idea of a conscious leadership that Lenin developed, that point in some very different directions, and I'd like to discuss them, among other things, because they've been very influential in my own thinking, although I would say that I no longer regard them as adequate. The first was developed by Alexander Bogdanov. He was part of a group of Bolsheviks who agreed with Lenin that it was necessary to have a conscious leadership, but he rejected the idea that the point of that leadership was primarily to play on immediate contradictions in order to gain state power, but argued rather that you actually had to cultivate a communist consciousness among the people through organizing and through liberal education. And so his group actually ran a liberal arts college for members of the Russian proletariat at the home of writer Maxim Gorky in Capri. Very interesting approach. Second, and much more influential, Antonio Gramsci, who was the leader of the Italian Communist Party during the time of fascism, was very much focused on understanding the process by which the fascists had gained power, trying to understand how so many workers and peasants and members of the petty bourgeoisie were drawn to support someone who advocated policies, who implemented ruthlessly policies that were contrary to their own interests. And Gramsci did this by developing a whole new understanding of the nature of state power, suggesting that a strategy that he called dictatorship was fundamentally inadequate and unstable. Specifically, by dictatorship he meant any regime that uses pure coercion in order to remain in power. More common, he said, was what he called transformismo, which was a term current in Italian politics that describes kind of the co-optation, politics of co-optation, of horse trading, of giving this constituency one favor and another constituency another favor. That, he said, is more stable, but it makes it very difficult to carry out a systematic transformation of the society because you are constantly making concessions to groups with competing interests and agendas. What he advocated instead was what he called hegemony, which is basically very subtly rewriting the rules of the game. He saw Mussolini, in particular, coming to power effectively by doing this, by actually drawing on elements in the Italian democratic tradition in order to draw support for his fascist movement. In fact, the term fasci actually, within living memory of the time Mussolini came into power as late as the 1890s, was used to describe the revolutionary peasant organizations that were struggling for land reform. So he argues that what the fascists did was to draw on nationalistic, popular, religious ideas, particularly in places like Spain and Portugal, democratic ideas, like in the case of Italy, as a way of making it appear that fascism was in fact the natural expression of the people's traditions. And he says that the only way to resist fascism is for the left to do the same thing. And so he was one of the first leaders in the communist movement to advocate drawing explicitly on popular religious traditions. There's a long-standing tradition in Italy of the Gesù Socialista, for example. He thought that was a healthy thing. and more broadly to use those kinds of popular traditions as a form of transition, as a bridge to communist consciousness. And this has then been articulated into what is usually called now a strategy of cultural hegemony, that it's not simply a question of gaining control of the state, but of penetrating all cultural institutions and reshaping them so that they promote a worldview which is compatible with transcending capitalism. There were also some distinctive variants of Lenin's strategy that developed in the Third World, what used to be called the Third World, Asia, Africa, Latin America. One of those is based on something called dependency theory or world systems theory, and it is based on an argument that capitalist development is effectively impossible without colonies. That's an idea that goes back to the Narodniks, the Russian populists, and in the 60s and 70s, and to some extent into the 1980s, this was a very popular view, particularly in parts of Latin America, parts of South Asia, some places in India, because it looked at that point like incorporation into the world system was simply holding back economic development in those countries. And the idea, therefore, was that rather than needing to go through a bourgeois democratic revolution first and then move on to socialism, that the third world countries could and should make a direct transition to socialism, drawing on primarily a peasant base, drawing on the often very communitarian traditions of village communities. And here we see the idea, therefore, of organizing the countryside, surrounding the city with the countryside, both literally and figuratively. Literally through a process of prolonged popular war, literally a peasant war which surrounds the cities until they can't go on anymore, and then figuratively by progressively surrounding the imperial metropoles and depriving them of the colonial base they need as formerly dependent capitalist countries pursue their own path of development. There were certain elements of this that were also present in the ideas of Mao Zedong in China. Certainly the idea of surrounding the city with the countryside. That phrase actually comes from Lin Biao, who was one of Mao's colleagues. But Maoism had some other specific elements as well. Mao believed fundamentally that even petty commodity production, small producers who don't employ any significant number of workers but sell their goods in the marketplace, believe that petty commodity production reproduces bourgeois ideology. And so he thought it was necessary to engage in constant ideological struggle in order to prepare people for actually transcending capitalism. And he also believed that there was a constant danger of capitalist restoration as long as petty commodity production persisted. And thus his emphasis on very active ideological struggle both during, before, and after the revolution. Many ways, in many ways, a very catastrophic experience for China, because as that set of ideas was leveraged both by Mao and some of his sometimes allies, sometimes adversaries in the course of the Cultural Revolution, they very nearly destroyed an entire civilization. So, you're probably asking where I stand, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that before we conclude this particular session. So it is probably no secret at this point that my perspective is deeply rooted in Marx's contributions, deeply rooted in the broader tradition of those who have struggled to transcend capitalism. Among other things, I think that the need of the vast majority of people to sell their labor power in order to survive is utterly in contradiction with not just the liberal values of rational autonomy, of acting in accord with conscience, because, if you got to do what your boss says, then you can't necessarily do what you think is right. But also the broader spiritual traditions that came out of the axial age. I mean, how can you be seeking enlightenment if you got to do what the boss says? How can you be promoting harmony? How can you be fulfilling the law, mending the torn fabric of the cosmos? At the same time, obviously, as I've suggested already, there are a number of other people in the tradition of social theory who I think make some very important contributions. Obviously, I share Weber's focus on meaning, and I also am deeply, deeply, deeply influenced by Durkheim and his understanding of the central role of solidarity and of collective effervescence in catalyzing the emergence of new meanings. And hopefully it's also apparent that I am by no means an uncritical follower of Marx. So I'd like to identify, to begin with, some key criticisms of both Marx and of his interpreters. First is kind of ironic because Marx considers himself a materialist, but I would argue that he vastly underestimates the role of material factors. Specifically, he underestimates the role of ecological factors. He shares the 19th century triumphalist view that technology will eventually allow us to conquer nature, bend it to our will. There's certainly very powerful strains within the historic socialist and communist movements, which really believed that we could push back the boundaries of finitude by means of scientific, technological, and economic progress. In that sense, does not break with that aspect of the dominant capitalist order. And more broadly, I would suggest that Marx doesn't really grasp the limitations of contingency. When in the Paris manuscripts, Marx argues that communism is the solution to the riddle of history, that it overcomes the contradiction between existence and essence. He is in effect saying that it makes us the power of being as such, which is tantamount to saying that it divinizes, that it makes us God. And of course the idea that some sort of political process happening within phenomenal reality, within the realm of time and space and contingency, the idea that something happening within that realm could somehow transcend that realm is simply contradictory. On the other hand, Marx misses the fact that labor is already an intellectual act, and in the process misses the fact that it is part of a broader teleological ordering. It is part of the ordering of all contingent beings to being as such. Everything in the universe, as Aristotle pointed out, seeks being to the extent of its capacity and in accord with its nature. So minerals take advantage of thermodynamic stability in order to persist in being. Plants seek being through nutrition, growth, and reproduction. Animals seek being through sensation, by taking in the world around them, and by locomotion, by being in more of the world. We do that through the intellect and the will, and Marx is quite adept in capturing our distinctive capacity, because we understand how things work, to participate in the actual process of creation itself. But by not putting that in its broader teleological context, in the context of a broader ordering to being, Marx misses something very important. Third, Marx, I think, fundamentally misunderstands the process of proletarianization. Marx thinks that proletarianization is going to radicalize the working class and make it revolutionary. And instead, and again, the elements for understanding this are in his own theory, it alienates and leads to the emergence of authoritarian personalities. When people are forced to sell their labor power in order to survive, they lose touch with what makes them human, and they take refuge in submission or domination or both. And probably at some point I'll do an extended video on that that draws particularly on the work of Eric Fromm. And so there's a fundamental political problem there because there is no natural constituency for socialism. There's no natural constituency for communism, at least not as aiming towards the decommodification of labor power, because capitalism fundamentally destroys our humanity. Fourth, I think Hayek is right that socialism fails to solve the information problem. While that doesn't mean that we can't do good things by using the state to centralize resources and target them to places where they're needed, it's not at all clear that the state is the most appropriate entity to, for example, decide how many blue jeans we need to produce in a particular year. That just really doesn't make sense. And finally, I would argue, and again, I'll probably do another video on this, that socialism, in the sense of leveraging the power of the working class and its allies in order to take control of the state, whether through elections or through some sort of insurrection or popular war, and then to use state power to transform society, that turns out not really to be a form of transition to communism. It is much more historically, as we've seen, a strategy for capitalist development, for the primitive accumulation of capital in countries that have been colonized by the major capitalist powers or which have been marginalized by the major capitalist powers. And ultimately, I would argue, it is a strategy for imperial restoration. And that's what we see happening most radically in Russia, although we see it to a certain degree in China. China I think, remains much more deeply informed both by its own historic spiritual traditions and also by socialist values of a kind. And we see it even in a place that was not a revolutionary society like India, where they had a social democratic transition to independence. So all of those, I think, remain some very, very, very fundamental problems. More broadly, I would like to argue that revolutionary strategy since the 17th century has been dominated by the illusion of sovereignty, that we can somehow gain effective control over a territory and its people and use that to do whatever it is that we're trying to do. But for a revolutionary, to use state power, to seize state power as the precondition for revolutionary social transformation. As I've suggested in some of our earlier discussions of power, this presupposes a univocal metaphysics in which everything exists in the same way, and the differences are only quantitative. Who is more powerful? And is there an infinitely powerful player, God, who the sovereign represents? Or are we trying to come as close as we can to creating that ourselves, individually and collectively? And I'd like to argue that this is a fundamental misunderstanding of reality, that power, because it is relational, is radically distinct from control, that the most profound power, the power of being as such, is in a way utterly different from everything else and acts as final cause, as a lure, as a teleological attractor. And that we grow and develop and build structures and accomplish things as contingent beings, as human beings, or anything else that we encounter in the world, not by being controlled by that power, but by being lured by it and drawn by it, and that therefore sovereignty is fundamentally an illusion. It's impossible. But when we pursue that illusion, we do a lot of damage. This then has some very important implications for the way in which we understand organizing. Okay? Again, going back to the relational understanding of power that we discussed at the beginning of this series, our aim strategically always needs to be to draw people forward by means of the attractive power of our vision and by then challenging and nurturing them. We need to be like the sun that draws plants upward. We need to be like the rain, which nurtures them, like the minerals in the soil, which nurtures them. We need to think of political strategy as more like tending a garden and less like scorched earth policy. The other thing that's important here is that formal organizations, including the state, are not fully real. They are, in a certain sense, a surface layer of what is happening socially, that the underlying networks of individuals within formal organizations and the structures which order those networks to broader civilizational ideals are much closer to reality. I won't say that that is the ultimate reality either, but they are much, much, much closer. And that is what we need to be aiming at engaging and transforming. In very real sense, it means that it might actually be possible to make a revolution without anyone knowing, or at least without it being obvious, because the most profound changes are always hidden, and it takes a certain depth to see them taking place. Now, that doesn't mean, and I'll be clear about this, that we never use force. There are times when there are bad things happening that we need to control. I'm not an anarchist. Don't think we should be getting rid of the state. But we need to understand that force is useful defensively. It is not a valuable tool for social transformation. We also need, as we're thinking about global strategy in the present period, to understand the very difficult character of the current situation, which really constitutes a multi-dimensional crisis of our civilization. First, we have an ecological crisis, which may be threatening the very habitability of the planet. This crisis is rooted in industrial technology, which breaks down existing forms of organization through combustion in order to release energy to do work. And that combustion is literal. The accumulation of carbon, which is its result in the atmosphere, is warming the planet and may render it uninhabitable for humanity. Even if that doesn't happen, it is likely to, at this point, cause, at the very least, substantial disruption in the structures of civilization as we know it. It will also ultimately release more pathogens that have been in various ways segregated from centers of human population. Simply the growth of the population, the destruction of habitat, and the growing interconnectedness of the planet will tend to make those pathogens circulate more quickly. And so we are likely to see continuing pandemics, including possibly pandemics that we can't resolve. Second, at the technological level, we are now seeing the emergence of what they're calling artificial intelligence. I'm not sure it's artificial intelligence, but it's something. And it is beginning to render human labor power redundant. We've seen that already with many more routine forms of material production, but particularly in the past year or so, we've seen the movement of AI into the generation of images, into the generation of text, And we've seen companies beginning to systematically slash and burn their employee cadre in those areas. Third, at the economic level, we are seeing a fundamental change in class structure as we see the radical proletarianization of the population. People are gradually losing the limited control over the use of their labor power that they once had. And that is not just something that affects people in lower skill occupations. It is affecting physicians who are now forced to defer to insurance companies about medical judgments. It is affecting attorneys. It is affecting professors. It is affecting quite literally everybody. And as we've said, proletarianization leads to alienation. It leads to the destruction of our underlying human capacity for creativity and our underlying human capacity to know what's right and to do what's right. At the same time, and again, this is probably a topic for another video, we see the emergence of capital as an autonomous intelligence independent of the historic bourgeoisie. Essentially, we see the global market making the big decisions about the allocation of resources and therefore about what's going to happen. And that doesn't mean it's a conscious intelligence, but it is any more than ChatGPT or Midjourney are conscious intelligences. But they are operating as decision makers. At least capital is operating as the principal decision maker. And that does mean that the historic bourgeoisie, while remaining immensely privileged, even more privileged, say, than physicians who continue to make good salaries while being proletarianized, is also becoming a displaced and marginalized social class. This is accompanied by the emergence of large capitalist magnates, the Elon Musks of the world, the Jeff Bezos of the world, who are capable of global action that renders the state increasingly impotent. And so between the emergence of capital as an autonomous intelligence and the emergence of these capitalist magnates, states are increasingly weakened by comparison. At the same time, particularly over the course of the past decade, we have seen a resurgence of territorial empire as an aim and an ideal. We see this very directly and very consciously in Russia, where Putin has essentially tried to reconstitute the Russian Empire and is supported by ideologues like Alexander Dugin, who envision a restored Russian Orthodox Empire as a major global power. We see it in a much more socially responsible way in China. But again, it's very explicit as the theorists in the Chinese Communist Party are beginning particularly to draw on the original ideology of empire in China, which is legalism or fa shui, and to synthesize that with both Confucian elements and with elements in the Chinese communist tradition. And we see it in India with Modi's attempt to transform India into a Hindu state, a Hindu empire, which it really never was historically. And it's also possible to read certain types of Islamism in that same light as well. And then finally, and this is really critical, particularly for the kind of work that I do, and probably that many of the people who are listening to this video do, there's the alienation generated by the commodification of labor power, so that people are increasingly cut off from their humanity. And, if you find that people don't really see what the problem is, you can detail all of these things and it doesn't really make a difference to them. Well, that's the alienated consciousness speaking. And ultimately that means that there is a real danger of fascism. There's a real danger Not simply that we're going to stagnate or take a few steps back in terms of the rights of particularly marginalized groups. What we are facing is a global assault on liberal and democratic rights. And so, in this context, I would argue for a kind of two-pronged strategy. One which is focused primarily on resisting fascism, and the other which is focused on the longer-term aims of reorienting and restructuring our society from within. And the historic and effective strategy of resistance to fascism is the Popular Front. Okay? And this means uniting everybody who is anti-fascist, from liberal conservatives. Liberal conservative is someone who upholds liberal rights, the right to free expression, the right to freedom of religion, including the freedom not to be religious, the right of assembly, the right to organize, and who accepts democracy at least to the extent of supporting structures which hold leaders accountable. So relationships with everybody from liberal conservatives to communists. Focus on resisting the principal manifestations of fascism, voter suppression, police violence and mass incarceration, restrictions on women's reproductive freedom, repression of gender nonconformists, restrictions on academic freedom, the book banning that we see going on. These are all the front lines where the fascists are eroding what we can do. And so to the extent that we're looking at politics in the narrower sense, whether it's electoral politics or issue campaigns or some other type of grassroots lobbying or something like that, these are really the key pressure points. This is where we need to be resisting. The other thing that we can do at that level, at the level of politics in the narrower sense, at the level of policy, and I think at the level of the Popular Front, although it becomes a question of struggle within the Popular Front, are social liberal reforms. Okay? I would argue that a great deal of what historic socialism did in terms of nationalizing industry and all of that kind of stuff really had very, very little impact on the decommodification of labor power, which is the central aim of communism. Much less impact than what used to be called kind of welfare state reforms. Public investments that create public goods like public transportation, educational institutions, other types of new public infrastructure, things that create a social wage, things that are provided directly without people having to pay for them, and also income transfers that reduce the pressure on people to sell their labor power in order to survive. We are a very long way from even knowing how to create a society where people never have to sell their labor power in order to survive. But we can reduce that pressure. And when we look at the impact of the very modest income transfers that took place during the first couple of years of the pandemic and the extent to which they promoted rapidly increasing wages among the most impoverished people in places like the United States, we really see the value of those kinds of policies. And unfortunately, a lot of those are being grabbed back, and that's the center of a lot of labor struggles now. But it was really a clear demonstration that things that may well be less radical may ultimately be more revolutionary. At the same time, I would say that over the long haul, we have a kind of work ahead of us that is fundamentally different than politics as it has ordinarily been understood. Capitalism, I would suggest, effectively destroys the social fabric It strips people of their ability to exercise their humanity. And so we need to rebuild social networks that will challenge people, present them with a more compelling ideal, a more profound ideal, and nurture them in the cultivation of the capacities they need to realize that ideal. And that is how we are going to get people to gradually see beyond and act beyond capitalism. It really is a matter of rebuilding institutions and communities. People often, again, confuse institutions and formal organizations. Institutions are networks of people that are structured, ordered in a certain way, in a certain pattern to achieve certain ends. And so rebuilding institutions and reordering institutions is ultimately what it's about. And this is a work that takes a great deal of time and commitment. It is, at the very least, multi-generational. And that's why, again, kind of going back to some of the other sessions in this series, organizing is so important, and particularly the work of identifying and nurturing primary leaders, civilizational leaders, people who think in the long term. Well, I'd like to thank you for your attention during this very extended discussion. To be honest, I actually broke this up into a couple of different pieces, but it turned out to be very long nonetheless. If you like the video, please press the like button. If you want more, please subscribe and consider supporting us from our Patreon page. It does take quite a bit of time and work to produce these videos. I know that perhaps my production values are not at the level of the YouTube magnates yet, although I'm working at it. But any support that you can offer really will be appreciated. And also check out our other websites. We are doing some other interesting work. Some of that is just beginning, and we'll have to see kind of what pace it develops and where it goes. But there may be some other ways for us to engage each other more directly. Thank you so much.